Then, of course, major drive and change is the technical perspective. We are really changing the way we work as journalists. We're no longer journalists who are focused purely on the story and have the specialists helping them get the story along. No, we have to be able to use the technology ourselves in the field to get the story distributed to the right audience. So, what are the drivers from technology perspective? Well, we see that bandwidth is increasing dramatically all over the world, especially, of course, traditionally in Western Europe and the United States. We see a huge bandwidth, but we also see the bandwidth increase in the region of Turkey and in the Middle East, and we see bandwidth increase very dramatically in Southeast Asia. So there's a lot more bandwidth to push new media through, new stories, much more interactively, much more focused on rich content. So that's both terrestrially, that means implies in the ground, in the cables, as also mobile technologies making giant leaps and steps all over the world. You get a higher penetration of computer ownership, and that also implies specifically post-PC devices. And post-PC devices meaning tablets, smartphones, etc., that are no longer dependent on input by mouse or keyboard, but are really easy going in your palm of your hand devices, where you can fast look up new news stories. Also is the fact, a very much big driver is the fact that memory is increasingly cheap. So it gets ever more cheap over time. The cost per megabyte, or the cost per gigabyte, or the cost per terabyte is dramatically dropping. So that means we have masses of storage. Masses of storage means or implies that we can store lots of content and accumulate lots of content, which poses a real opportunity, but it also poses a threat. If you have the luxury of storing lots of content, you also have a threat that this content becomes lost, or you cannot easily find content. It requires very much organizational skills to organize your content and get the content to the right group of people. So that's also a major drive in this whole move towards new journalism and new competences that we require for these journalists. And then, of course, there's a huge boom of all kinds of software and hardware platforms that we call the cloud, right? The software and hardware is hosted in the cloud, and we can use this software from any place where we have internet access. And these are very, very sophisticated platforms that store, because of the low cost per byte ratio, store lots and lots of data in data centers all over the world, which is very handy, which is very good, and also requires new insights for the journalists themselves to be able to use them. But also requires that you ask yourself, if I store my content in the cloud, where is it stored and who is owner of that content? It poses all kinds of security issues. So this is a very important point in the development of new journalism. So, all these different aspects create a convergence. These media channels converge through digitization, and we have to update the methods that we use when we produce and distribute content. It requires new insights for the journalists themselves. Journalists are not merely people who write stories. Journalists have to have an insight in technological possibilities, not just to make the stories and bring the stories, but also to find the stories. One of the fastest growing new competences for journalists is data journalism, where you go sieve through masses and masses of data that are online and try to find new perspectives on a story. All competences that are really important now for the new journalist. When we look at this, all these developments, this is a very complex model, and as a model itself might not seem that successful because there's lots of content in there. But this is actually a very insightful model, developed by Mark Pegram, an Australian colleague. And it shows 5 lenses in which all these digital aspects of development can find a place. Center is the technological drivers, the technological change. You can see that there are all kinds of things about cloud computing is very central. Internet of Things, or Web 3.0, where we store and exchange semantics. But there are also pedagogical or didactical aspects of digitization. There are also social aspects where we intercommunicate and how we intercommunicate. But also the social-political aspects of censorship, for instance, or counterculture, or networking internationally. And last but not least, an ecological framework where we look at durability, sustainability, etc. These are all aspects of digitization where the new journalist will find or has to find his or her own way. This is about new journalism. Now, how about teaching this new journalism? Because, as you can see, this is quite complex. There are masses and masses of perspectives that you can take on this subject. So how do we go about in teaching these new students this new journalism? Well, it basically fits somewhat in the same kind of model. Let's see how we used to train journalists, or how we used to teach in general. In the old way, we had a group of students in a classroom. You usually tell them to take off their hat. But you have a group of students in a classroom, and then you have a teacher, who's somewhat like me, with shorter hair. And this teacher tries to deliver a message, a didactical message, and does that by sending this message out, and the student, the class, receives this message and tries to emulate either behavior or knowledge, put it in practice. And this is what we call the behaviorist approach. This is the approach that we in the Netherlands, and it's also very much in the more Anglo-Saxon perspective, have tried to move away from. We try to stimulate students themselves to become active in the acquiring of knowledge. So in a new situation, we have a teacher who is part of a much larger scape of students who all try to what we call are cognitive apprentices. Cognitive apprenticeship in a connectivist strategy. They try to work together to find solutions to problems. The teacher, of course, is very much in the loop. The teacher is not someone, or the lecturer is not someone who sits back and let them work in a chaotic way. No, it's very much about coaching, about trying to get students to solve problems. And in this is the whole network idea. The students, not only as new journalists, have to use the network to find new sources of knowledge, because that's basically what journalists do, find new sources of knowledge and write their stories and share them. They do the same thing in finding the knowledge that they need to acquire to become good journalists. And this is what we call the connectivist approach. So connectivism is an approach where we try to learn students to fend for themselves, to acquire new